reveals that Canadians overwhelmingly have rejected separatist movements within their borders. Respondents were asked on public support for separatist activities in Canada. 8% said we somewhat support, 2% said we strongly support, 54% they said they're totally opposed to it, 36% said they didn't even know about it. So this entire fringe element overall is just about 2% that finds any kind of strong support. There are about 8% who are somewhere dilly-dally, but largely, it's a rejection or even ignorance of something like this even existing. The respondents were asked if Canada should implement stricter policies to prevent any group from using Canadian soil for foreign separatist agendas. 72% said yes, become stricter. Don't allow our land, our nation, our soil to be used for conducting separatist operations in other countries. 10% said no, 18% said they don't know. But again, an overwhelming number, nearly 90%, not in favor or not even aware of something like Canadian soil being used to foment separatist agendas across or in other nations. The respondents were then asked on perceptions of unfair scrutiny faced by Sikh Canadians. 30% of the respondents said yes, there is a perception of unfair scrutiny faced by Sikh Canadians. 33% said no, 37% said they had no clue. A total of 72% of the respondents actually supporting stricter policies to curb such groups, particularly targeting and particularly aimed at these K-goons, these K-separatists. A majority, 54%, believe their country should not be used as a platform for these extremist acts at all. And there's a strong stance that now reflects a broader sentiment among Canadians. They don't want these elements to be operating, flourishing, thriving on Canadian soil. Anand Ranganathan, author, scientist, political commentator with us. Terry Milersky, author with us. Daniel Boardman, journalist, should be joining us. Namaste, gentlemen. Greetings. Terry Milersky, Canadians outrightly rejecting the use of Canadian soil for separatist agendas or disturbing the peace, harmony, integrity, sovereignty of other foreign nations.
Yes, these results are quite striking because these are relatively soft questions. First thing I want to say is that Leger is a reputable polling organization. I think these figures are reasonable and they fit with what we've understood so far. And secondly, though, as I say, the questions are fairly soft. They're not asking about extremist activities, just any operations, even peaceful operations, of the Khalistani movement in Canada. Now, when you consider that, and you look at these results, you have to wonder, well, if they were asking about raising money for extremist activities in India, for example, then you'd get much higher objection, obviously. So even with these soft questions, is my point, you're finding an overwhelming opposition. I mean, remember, if a political party got these kinds of numbers in a poll, they would be extinguished. They would be wiped out in any election. These are pitiful numbers for the Khalistani movement, and it reveals the lie at the heart of it. And that lie is that if you're against the Khalistani movement, you're somehow anti-Sikh, as though all Sikhs are Khalistanis. But of course, they're not. And in taking the whole population and finding these pitifully low numbers of support, I think that the Leger has done a service by puncturing this balloon that somehow all the Sikhs are for Khalistan. They're not.
Will this now embolden those who had been quietened because of this entire muscle flexing and strong arming political narrative? Will there be more people who will now come and call out the Trudeau administration and the likes of Jagmeet Singh and his party, Daniel Boardman?
Yeah, I mean, this study's been out for about a month now and hasn't really resulted in like significant blowback. But it's also because we're in the middle of election, and the Canadian election cycle is 101% to do with Trump right now. So it's pure Trump panic, Trump paranoia, and all this. The Ledger poll came out before the heart of the sort of Canada-America trade war / 51st state conversation came out. So we're not seeing a lot of political movement in Canada because everyone's focused on something else. But as Terry said, like, this is a pretty striking numbers. This isn't ambiguous. This is essentially what this poll is asking is, hey, the Khalistan movement, how do you feel? And everyone's like, we don't like this. I mean, you see the 72% of people want the government to just do something about this. This is the people don't like this. Every time the Khalistan movement is in the news, they're doing something crazy, and the Canadian news is putting that soft sympathy music over it, right? They're screaming and yelling, and there's like the nice background music playing, and people just don't like it. That's what you're seeing. So hopefully this does add some political momentum where people can now get up within the political parties. Like, this is where you might see it within the Conservative Party, because the Conservatives like polls and data and spending 3 months to think about something that should take 3 minutes to think about. So you could very much see within the Conservative Party, someone could go around and say, listen, 72% of Canadians want someone to do something about this. It means we shouldn't be backing this movement. We should probably distance ourselves. That's probably the biggest reaction you would get is a quiet distancing from the political parties.
But that quiet distancing will also be significant. The other thing is, sometimes it's not sentiment, it's also the dollars, the funding, the donations for campaign funds. But those elements, if there is a crackdown, and you said the Trump administration is really training its guns on the fentanyl coming in from Canada, so a lot of these elements run their logistics businesses, and that money comes back funneled into some of these political agendas. Perhaps that will also dry up, those wells will also dry up. Dr. Ranganathan, initial thoughts? There's more to share with our viewers, but after your thoughts.
Good evening, Anand, and good evening to my fellow panelists. Well, my initial thought is that I need to retract my statement that I made a couple of months ago saying that Canada is the new Pakistan. No, my respect for Canadians have gone up. It's just that Trudeau was the new Imran Khan. So my apologies if any Canadians were offended then. No, look, a couple of points out here. I think both of the panelists are absolutely right. The poll reflects the current mood of Canada. Having said that, I think Dane is also right that, I mean, now Canada has a new, I wouldn't call it fixation, which is Trump. It's just that they've gone on a tangent. Their major issue is now concerning America and Trump. So maybe the Khalistan issue is a bit of a backseat for them right now. Having said that, one of the questions that had a bit of a iffy answer from the respondents was that have Sikhs come under increasing scrutiny? I dare say that possibly could have been clouded by the confusion that their attire without stereotyping them brings, because if you remember, in the aftermath of the 9/11, a lot of Sikhs were actually mistakenly assaulted, thinking that they are Islamists. So maybe some of the scrutiny in Canada, as far as Sikhs are concerned, is to do with that. I don't know. I mean, the Canadians would actually know more of that. But the second point is, I think people have also seen through the other interesting aspect, Anand.
Yeah.
Why is it that they worry? Number one, that there is no Khalistan issue or a movement in India, which is the birthplace of Sikhism, and they are trying to have it in Canada. And secondly, when the Sikh empire, most of the land was actually in Pakistan, less in India. Why is it that the modern day Khalistanis have that map of Khalistan where not even 1 inch of that Khalistani land is Pakistani land? So people can see through this propaganda. This is a wholly Pakistani driven, ISI driven propaganda, and I think I'm so glad that Canadians can see through it completely. Yeah.
Okay. See, I think there is a certain amount of history, and also somewhere the Indian diaspora and the Indian establishment also not setting the narrative straight. Sikhi goes up to the 14th, 15th century. It's not a new phenomenon in Bharat, but a lot of the narrative in Canada and also in some foreign soil, the whole narrative starts from 1984. Yeah. And thereafter 1990. So then what happens is the previous part of it is all obscured to a large population. And my apologies if I'm broad brushing. India, Pakistan, Bangladesh is the same region. It's all India, because most Bangladeshis call themselves I'm from India. Most Pakistanis suddenly become I'm from India. It becomes the same landmass. So to
South
get
Asia.
even South Asia and even to even Nepalis, Sri Lankans, a lot of them, till the time the identity is established and otherwise broadly it's all taste of India.
Like Canadians are Americans, North Americans.
No, that is for just Justin Trudeau to deal with Donald Trump in terms of the governor. But I'm just saying, I'm not getting into that. I'm just saying in terms of perception in the West and in these countries. The other thing is that this Raja Ranjit Singh's map and what was actually Punjab.
I'm glad you brought it.
Lot of Indians themselves don't know. A lot of Pakistanis themselves don't know. Current day Sikhs are not aware. So how are we going to turn around and say second, third generation migrants who are now Canadian citizens who moved away from here, how are we going to talk to them, or in the UK or in Australia? It's all about how much you inform and how much somebody else is able to misinform. We got more on this. The survey highlighted in an earlier CNN News 18 report actually aligns with findings showing limited support for Khalistani movement internationally, including the US, UK and Germany. The demand for action stems from a series of disturbing incidents between 2021 and 2025, including attacks on Hindu temples and incidents involving Indian consulates. Among the most concerning events were the multiple burglaries and vandalism at Hindu temples in the Greater Toronto area in late 2021, early 2022, the vandalizing of the BAPS Sri Swaminarayan Mandir in Windsor, and the anti-Hindu graffiti in April 2023, the posting of Khalistani threats against Indian diplomats on 2 Surrey temples in September 2023, tensions escalating further with clashes between pro-Khalistani supporters and temple attendees in the Hindu Sabha Mandir in Brampton during a consular event on the 3rd of November 2024, this coinciding with another attack on the Lakshmi Narayan Mandir in Surrey that same day. And just over a week later, a planned consular event at Triveni Mandir in Brampton was cancelled due to credible threats of violence from Khalistani groups. So these incidents happened. Was it always only CSIS, Canadian intelligence and the Khalistani elements in Canada? Or were there others also who were goading them to somewhere create a pinprick for India, somewhere hurt its soft image, soft power image, Terry Miller's geek? And do you believe with the Trump administration and the posture that they have taken, these elements will perhaps be going and hiding in their burrows for a while?
Well, I think that one figure that stood out for me when I looked at this poll was the surprisingly high level of awareness on the part of Canadians in the 30s, I believe it was, people who believe that Sikhs in general have got a bum rap, that they're getting an unfair scrutiny from the Canadian government, because these Canadians are obviously aware that most Sikhs are not Khalistanis. They're aware of that unfairness, that they should be targeted for the actions of what people do correctly see as a very small minority. And I think when you look at the detail of this poll, and you see things like that stick out for me, that people do seem to know what's going on. They do seem to know that they're being conned by the Khalistanis in Canada into thinking that this is some sort of mass movement of the Sikhs worldwide. You're right to point out that we have seen in recent years similar results from the United States, from the UK significantly, and elsewhere around the world, including Australia, where you've got this, as soon as you start asking hard questions, who really supports this? How many people will support a crackdown, if you will, on Khalistanis? And you get surprisingly high numbers, considering that there's been almost a monopoly on the debate on the part of the Khalistanis. They're the ones who are doing the marches. They're the ones who are making public statements about India being a terrible genocidal state and so forth. They're the ones making the running on this. They're the ones making the most noise, but it does not seem to be working. And that is the significant impression that I get from this poll, and many others like it over the years.
No, but Daniel, the CSIS or the Canadian State Intelligence was keeping them on their radar. They were interacting with these elements. So could these elements have flourished, gotten the kind of attention they do, because they've entered polity, administration, policy, etc.? Or is there a soft state backing, in the shadows, which is tacit to some of these fringe elements?
Well,
and to what end?
Yeah, I mean, I'm not at CSIS headquarters in on the plans. It could be a conflict. I don't think this is like, state-backed Canada doing this. I wouldn't listen. I don't believe in conspiracies of hyper-competence. I believe in conspiracies of mass incompetence. It totally tracked with Canadian in the last 40 years of Canada to just have some sort of, laissez-faire attitude towards extremism, thinking they can just manage a conflict or get it away, or just listen on one phone line and just until things spiral out of control. I mean, I do think there is hard state backing to this. We know the Pakistanis have been backing financially the Khalistan movement for a long time, and here in Canada, we have a pretty soft approach. We don't have RICO laws, so it's very hard for us to clean up an entire criminal outfit. And I think the real reason why the Khalistan movement has flourished in Canada is because we sort of have this soft on crime, soft on extremism, and for the most part, we like to ignore problems until they become too evident. And I think what this poll has shown is that the average Canadian citizen can now see something to do with the Khalistan movement, even if they don't follow it closely. I mean, the numbers is 20% of Canadians even follow this issue. They say most don't follow, but even in that, those who do not follow see this and do not like it. So I don't think there's it makes no sense for CSIS to be using the Khalistan movement as some sort of right? We really needed a drug trafficking logistics setups in Canada. We really needed that. That's for our geostrategic interests. I don't buy it in that way, but I think a lot of the rise of the Khalistan movement can be explained by 40 years of head in the sand behavior by the Canadian establishment. I think that gets you to where you are today. People always think you need these hyper-competent intelligence agencies, and they push a button that throws a coup, and that's not really how life works. Is there maybe parts of CSIS that have been potentially compromised by Khalistanis? Did they infiltrate somewhere? Is the RCMP recruiting from extremist factions? Wouldn't be the first time the RCMP has recruited the ideological extremists to be the head of extremist monitoring. I mean, they're very friendly they always go to recruit Muslims from the Muslim Brotherhood instead of the general community. So it wouldn't be shocking if they try and recruit Khalistanis instead of normal Sikhs to try and, reason with the Khalistanis in some failed logic way. But to say that the Canadian state really wants this and this is a intelligence asset to us, I think that's a bit
no, it's not about the intelligence asset to us. It's about this theory, Dr. Ranganathan and the other gents, please weigh in on this, that for a long time the US used Canada as its backyard to dump certain elements who were undesirable across the world but could be used by America as a deep state tool or a intelligence tool via the CIA to try and foment trouble in these countries somewhere to exercise. So it's the, what we say, Rajniti, diplomacy, statecraft, however you'd want to see. And there is an ugly side to it. It's the underbelly of statecraft. Is there merit to something like that? And because all of this dies down and they all pipe down the moment the administration changes. And it's all happening in these Five Eyes nations largely, Germany the only exception. Dr. Ranganathan.
I agree with both Terry and Daniel largely, except a slight variation to what Daniel just said. Of course, he made very logical assumptions and points. Let me tell you where I differ from him slightly. Number one, when he talks about Canada being a soft state on Khalistan, and he says, I don't think we've been soft. I think that's not entirely true, because there is no Al-Qaeda movement right now in Canada, is there? So when Canada wants to be hard and go after the terrorists, it does. The fact of the matter is that Canada has been traditionally soft on Khalistanis. We've been demanding extradition of hardcore terrorists, including the bombers of Kanishka, and we've been denied that for decades. So Canada, because of its home constituency, has been traditionally soft on Khalistani terrorists. That's a fact. It's at variance from, how Canada deals other terrorists of other ideologies. And number two, here I do agree with both Terry and Daniel. There has been a large-scale infiltration of Khalistani elements into the various arms of Canada. We saw that in fact, as we talk, you're showing that protest where police officers were actually Khalistanis. So, when you have infiltration, I agree there is very little the state can do, because ultimately the power that is to be exercised is by those elements who have infiltrated. We've seen that in the last
See,
1.5
you know,
to 2 years.
here's the trick.
after-
What happens is that person is a noble Canadian citizen. That person is not
Right.
doing anything against Canadian law, but that person harbors off duty, on duty, and ill will against another nation and supports a cause which is beyond and about thousands of miles away from Canada. So in their head, they believe they're doing nothing wrong because they've not done anything against the Canadian laws. But what they're doing is they're using Canadian soil to try and orchestrate activities that tantamounts to calling for breaking up of another sovereign nation. That's where the whole thing. Yes, Terry.
Can I give you a couple of examples of what
Yeah.
a state can do if it wants to get serious and it does not want to pursue the laissez-faire, let them have their demonstrations attitude that has prevailed in Canada lo these many years. The first would be going back to 1984, which you rightly saw as the origin of much of this, when Ajit Singh Bagri spoke famously at the World Sikh Organization's founding convention in New York at Madison Square Garden. He spoke on behalf of Tovinder Parmar, the leader of the Air India, the Kanishka bomb plot, because Parmar wasn't allowed into the United States. They presented themselves at the border and they said, no, we're not going to have Parmar in our country, thank you very much. And they would not allow him in. And so Bagri had to make the speech for him. Second case, there was supposed to be another Air India bombing. People have forgotten now that the state, in this case the FBI in New York, frustrated that plot, busted the plot, planted surveillance cameras in a hotel room, and got them on tape, organizing the bombing of a second Air India plane, Flight 112, I believe, shortly after the Kanishka bombing in June of 1985. So that's, to me, those are a couple of telling examples. I could give you others, where if you take a more aggressive attitude, guess what? The plane that was going out of New York did not get bombed. And there was a much more aggressive attitude at the time. The FBI, for example, was also going after a plot against Rajiv Gandhi to take his life in an assassination plot in that June. The Secret Service, the United States Secret Service, actually came to interview and ask a lot of embarrassing questions of Parmar and the other Khalistanis in Vancouver and British Columbia in the 2 weeks preceding the Air India bombing. So they were on top of it, and they were calling people to account and refusing to admit militants into the United States when Canada was throwing up its hands and say, oh, well, freedom of speech, let them have it.
Right. Now,
Yeah, I'm going to add one more thing because Arnand made
I just got another input and I'll come to you, Daniel. We'll take the conversation forward. I just have to put out this. We've got this. Intel sources close a home telling CNN News 18 that Sikhs feel that Khalistan issue is being blown out of proportion and fear their faith is being misrepresented largely. So they're being broad brushed as Khalistanis altogether, which they are not. Many have expressed concerns about attending Sikh places of worship, questioning whether they should bow before those promoting violence and terrorism. Top intelligence sources reveal that Sikh groups are deeply concerned about the damage this radical fringe is inflicting upon their own reputation for hospitality and charity. As minorities integrated into societies worldwide, they feel their positive contributions are being overshadowed by the actions of a select few. They also lament the lack of true leadership, with those involved in harassment and abuse hijacking their community's image. Yes, Daniel. So this is another thing, that private gurdwaras in Surrey and what happened in Southall in London, where devotees who go in to pray were being forced to bow to the likes of Bhindranwale and guns and all, which are being kept on display in gurdwaras. Whereas Sikhi tenets very clearly say you need to bow only to the holy book, that is the Guru Granth Sahib, and to the main area. Other than that, you don't need to bow to anybody else other than the 10 gurus. But this is something which is being done, and there is a certain quiet intimidation that's happening, and anybody who resists is then harassed outside. Life is made difficult, their businesses suffer. All of that has been happening. But yes, you're making a point.
Yeah, I mean, Arnand said that Canada doesn't have like an Al-Qaeda extremist problem. We do have a problem with radical Islamists and all different types of extremism. This doesn't make it to India so much, but synagogues being firebombed. Every weekend I see, groups of waving Hamas flags, Hezbollah flags, designated terrorist organizations, openly calling for the annihilation of Jewish people, breaking multiple types of hate speech or whatever type of laws we have. So Canada, in terms of all type of extremism, is out of control, just for reference. And you make a good point here. Like, this is sort of a well-known thing, is a lot of these major gurdwaras have been compromised, and it's a big problem within the Sikh community. The Sikh community has been trying to deal with it itself, but with no help. And this kind of is the sad state of Canada, where you have the Sikh community, which doesn't like the Khalistan. You have the Hindu community, which is being attacked by the Khalistan. You have the wider Canadian community, which doesn't like the Khalistan movement. But for whatever reason, the political establishment is deeply in bed with the Khalistan movement, and all the money is flowing into there. So they have the major gurdwaras, they have the buildings, they have the infrastructure, and they've sort of taken over it. But it's this radical fringe that runs the entire thing, and it's causing problems primarily for, well, say the victims, right? The people who are attacked, but then also the Sikh community, who's has to, they just might want to throw in a normal prayer. I mean, I've been to gurdwaras all over India. Zero pictures of terrorists so far. That's not what you can say in Canada. Like, I wouldn't have my, I wouldn't be able to go to as many gurdwaras in Canada as I did in India, and without seeing a picture of Tawinder Parmar in my face.
And that's true, and I think there is a resistance there. These private gurdwaras have been an issue even in Australia, where there is a donation box for Khalistan, and if you don't, on your way out, if you don't donate there, there is somebody who will stand there in front of you trying to quietly intimidate you or tell you that you have to donate there and you have to pay attention there before you leave the gurdwara. Otherwise, you're noted, and and if you resist, if you participate in activities that are pro-India, pro-Bharat, and not suiting their agenda, then businesses are suffered. Intimidation happens. Suddenly, their children going to school will find something, thrown at them. Some messaging that happens. You better watch it, or some in terms of deliberate shaming of their kids on social media. Social media shaming and bullying that happens rampantly. I've spoken to people who've actually faced this in the UK, in Australia, and that's why I'm sharing that. I don't know if that happens in Canada too, because a lot of people saying, we don't back this, we don't back this, we don't back them, but we can't come out in the open because the system doesn't protect our interests.
This is an important point, if I can, and I commend to you something called the Bloom Report, which is a long British government report done initially commissioned, I believe, by Prime Minister Boris Johnson, as he then was. And long story short, this lays out a truly frightening account of the suppression of dissent within the Sikh community. The reason, according to this report, the reason you don't hear too many Sikhs complaining about Sikh Khalistani militancy is because they're scared. And he tells stories, for example, of prominent people in British life, public life, elected members of parliament, who refused to speak to him on the record for fear that they would be targeted if it were known what they were saying. So they had to speak anonymously. Legions of them. And there are pages of this material in the Bloom Report, which is online. I commend it to your viewers, because it tells you a lot of detail, and it's embarrassing for Britain, a lot of detail about the almost terror environment in which you live if you support, if you don't support the Khalistan movement. It's quite frightening. And it does happen in Canada. Remember, this is where we had the beating of Balraj Diol, the beating of Ujjal Dosanjh.
Yes.
We had Air India bombing witnesses, not just threatened, but murdered. And they should not be forgotten in this. So this tendency continues in Britain, in the UK, and in Canada, and in Australia. Yes, it's going on all the time, and we don't hear about it because that's the point.
Yeah, they try, and that's the intimidation. Yes, Dr. Ranganathan, final word, have to move on.
Very quickly, Daniel said that we see regularly the photos and portraits of Khalistani terrorists in Canada, but I did not see it in India. Well, let me correct him slightly at the risk of being civilly embarrassed about it. With what face do we criticize Canada for harboring and displaying these portraits when in the holiest of shrines, the complex that houses the Golden Temple, the assassins of Indira Gandhi, the terrorists were venerated. They were worshipped. They still are. So, before we castigate Canada for it, we ourselves have been soft on this. And this goes on every year. And we have routinely our Indian politicians who are member of parliament going there and worshipping and venerating these terrorists.
True, and I think
good
somewhere that has to be stopped, and that starts only when the current generation is apprised that Sikhi goes far beyond and far before 1984, and the origins of Sikhi are nowhere from but from the offshoots of Hindutva. That's where it is. Gents, thank you very much. We've got more news coming in. Have to move on. Dr. Ranganathan stays on with us for the latter half of this edition of The Right Stand. But first up,